Hi, welcome back to Christine's Home Affairs. Today's video I'm going to show you how to do a quilted placemat that's got a cutlery pocket in it as well. So we're going to be quilting, we're going to be making the placemat, and we're also going to be working with double fold bias binding tape for the edge of our placemat. This one's a great one to make as Christmas gifts for kids, so you can personalise it and put your children's names on there and give them their own personal pieces of cutlery. It'll be a good one for picnic sets as well. Stick around. Before I forget, I did go to the post office this afternoon and I got something in the mail, so let's open it up together. This is from Canada. Let's see what we've got. It says fabric on the front. Ooh. That's a pretty piece. I'm assuming it's a maple leaf because maples are from Canada, right? I'm a little bit geographically challenged. Stonehenge, Oh Canada, 10th anniversary special edition. Oh, that is beautiful. The Deborah Edwards fabric from Northcote Studios. So if you like this fabric and you want to find that, that's what it is. I'll just give you the details there. Can you guys read that? That is a beautiful piece of fabric. I'm going to make something with that. What a cute card. Hello Christine, and thank you for all the wonderful tutorials you post on YouTube, for your sunny disposition, for a part of your life you share with us, and to the clear instructions you provide. Since I'm in Canada, and to show my appreciation, I thought I would send you a little something that is representing of our homeland. Glad to see you're on the mend. Thanks again, and please keep your videos coming. A big fan. Lucky. I'm glad you put Lucky there because I need to pronounce your name now. You've commented many times, and in my head I can pronounce this perfectly. Lucretia? Lucky, thank you very, very much. That is a beautiful piece of fabric. I'm going to make something really nice with that, I'm sure. Thank you so much. And of course, your card will be going up on my wall, and I will be sending you one of my Christine's Home Affairs postcards. That will be going out in the mail for you tomorrow. Thank you again. That's really lovely. Okay, here's what we need. A piece of fabric that is 6.5 inches wide by 10 inches long. That will be folded in half for our pocket. For the right side of the front of our placemat, we need 6.5 inches by 13 inches. I'll put the centimetres up on the screen in a minute. Then we have, for the left front side of the placemat, we want a 13 by 13 inch square. Then for the backing fabric, we've got 13 inches by 19 inches. And for the palin, I have a piece that is 14 inches by 20 inches. Here are your measurements in centimetres and in inches. This is just a very lightweight batting. It's fusible on one side. It doesn't matter what you use, it's something that you'd be able to throw in the wash. You may have noticed that this is a little bit bigger than the backing fabric, and the reason for that is that we're actually going to be quilting some lines on the fabric to keep the layers together, and we'll be binding it at the end of it. So the first thing that we're going to do is take our 13-inch square piece of fabric and our 6.5 inch by 13-inch rectangle, and we're going to take our pocket piece. For the pocket piece, all you need to do is fold that in half and press it. If you want to do a top stitch, you can, and also if you want to put some stabilizer behind this, you can as well. I think I might actually do that because otherwise it's a little bit flimsy. I've grabbed another piece of lightweight palin. I've cut that at 5 inches by 6 inches. And what we're doing here, we're going to fold this fabric in half. And this pellin is going to be fused to the inside of the fabric. We're fusing it on half the fabric, and we're going to leave 1/4 of an inch on either side. The bottom doesn't matter. So what I'll do is fuse that onto my pocket piece. I'll fold that in half and fuse that together. And I'll quickly go and do that now before we do the next step. Okay, I have fused the pellin onto one side of the pocket and folded that in half. We need to put these 3 pieces together now. So I'm going to place this pocket on the bottom edge of the 13-inch square. So you want to make sure when you turn that the right way around that if you're using a fussy cut piece of fabric that you've got the right orientation for your picture. So place that on the edge there, then take your side strip and we're going to place those right side together. So with those 3 layers of fabric sandwiched together, we can take this to the machine and with 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, sew all the way down on that side. If you don't want to use 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, you don't have to. You can use 1 centimetre, you can use 1/2 inch. It really doesn't matter as long as you're consistent throughout your project. So I'm doing 1/4 inch seam allowances for this today. In fact, I think this is the only seam that we need to sew. Let's take it to the machine and stitch down here. All you need to do is a back stitch at the beginning and the end, and if you like, you can actually double stitch over the pocket section. Now I'm coming up to the pocket section here where the fold of the pocket is. If you like, you can double stitch over that. I generally do like to do that. That just helps prevent the pocket from coming out later on. So there we've got our side panel and our pocket. So what we've got here is the front pocket stitched in the centre here. It's just hanging loosely at the moment. And I've pressed this with the seam going to the 13-inch side of the fabric. And the reason I've done it to that side, we have the bulk of this pocket section here. If we bring it to the pocket side, it creates a little bit too much bulk. So the seam underneath is facing the 13-inch piece. Normally I would go and top stitch this in place, but I'm going to quilt it soon, so it's not necessary. Now we'll take our pellin, place that with the fusible side up, and we'll take this piece of fabric and we'll place that in the centre. Make sure that that seam underneath is facing the right direction. I'll now go and fuse this piece of pellin onto the front piece of my placemat. You can instead fuse your pellin onto the backing piece, but I think it provides better stability when you're going to quilt it. If you put it on the main piece, it's going to be seen. I'll fuse those pieces together and this pocket will remain loose. Okay, we have the pellin or wadding fused to the back of the placemat and the pocket section is still free to move. I'm going to quilt all the layers of fabric together, so the backing fabric and the front pieces together. But I don't want to quilt this pocket section because we need free access to that when we put our cutlery in. This is a heat erasable pen, so I'm going to be marking some lines on the front of my fabric. I'm just going to be doing some cross hatching, and cross hatching is just a bunch of diagonal squares. Find the 45-degree mark on your ruler if you have one and line that up on the straight edge of your fabric. I'll start at the corner and then I'll draw a line. So I've got a 45-degree angle line across there, and I can use that line as my guide for the rest of the lines that I'm going to draw. So then you want to determine how far apart you want your quilting lines. I will probably just do them 2 inches apart, I think. So I've got the 2-inch line here, which I'm lining up on the line that I've drawn. Draw the next line. Now I'm not drawing onto the pocket piece. And repeat that all the way. When you get to the the side section here, you can continue the line down, and if you want to, you can continue the line underneath. At this point, you can open up your pocket section and bring it to the other side and keep marking your lines. So once you've done that side, you just flip it around and continue on from that original line that you've done. So once you've done your diagonal lines 2 inches apart, we can use any one of these diagonal lines as our guideline for the next 45-degree line that we want to draw. So you can line up any straight line on your ruler with any of the straight lines along here. If I go from the bottom corner, just find a reference line that you want to use and start marking your lines. And continue to follow that line that you've drawn to mark out the other 2-inch lines. Then you can go back in the other direction, and just remember to move your pocket piece out of the way as you need to. Okay, our crosshatch design is finished. We need to bring all the layers together now because we want to quilt the back and the front all at the same time. Let's flip this upside down. I can just see the outline of the fabric underneath, and I'll place my backing fabric right side up. I'll line the layers up as evenly as I can. If you have basting spray, that's always handy. You can spray the underside of the backing fabric and adhere that to your pellin, or you can even use a double-sided batting as well. Bring that back around the right way. Make sure all the layers are nice and smooth. And if you have curved quilting pins, they'll make the job a lot easier too. So we're just going to pin this together. And close up your pins so that you don't prick yourself. And the spacing of the pins is probably about palm distance apart. So when you're working on big quilts or bigger projects, you'll put the pins around your hand. That's a good guide as to how far apart you should space your pins. Okay, once you've pinned all of those sections in place, double check that the backing fabric isn't puckered, that it sits nice and flat. And remember, this pocket here needs to be free. Now we're going to the machine and we're going to sew on all of these drawn lines, but when we get to the pocket section, you'll stop. So you do a back stitch here. When you're doing these lines coming up this way, you'll stop here and do a back stitch. We want to be able to still manipulate the pocket from left to right. So as you come down this line here, you want to be able to move that pocket out of the way and then continue on with the quilting. Likewise, when you're sewing these lines in place, you want to make sure that the pocket is out of the way. Once you've sewn down to here, you can just flip your pocket over and then finish that line. So we want to at all times make sure that the pocket is able to be moved from left to right. Let's take it to the machine. I'm also going to be increasing my stitch length to probably about 4 or 4.5. I want a nice long stitch length. It'll make the job go a lot quicker and it'll help reduce some of the shifting that you can get in fabric. It really doesn't matter where you start, so I might as well start at the section where the pocket is. So I'll start right on the very edge of the seam. I'll do a back stitch at the beginning, continue on to the end. When my pins are in the way, I'll remove those. There's no need to push your work or pull at it either. You just let the machine guide the fabric through. When you've got a long stitch length like I have, it actually glides through really beautifully. Once that line's finished, I'll go to the next one. When I've finished one side, I'll just flip it around and start back up from the other side. And I've come up to this section where the pocket is and I need to continue on down. So let's flip the pocket out of the way and just continue to the end. Okay, we've done all the diagonal lines on one side in one direction. We'll turn this to the other side and quilt coming from the other direction. Move the pocket out of the way again. Cross-hatching is a great beginner's way to learn how to do some quilting. Builds your confidence, teaches you how to mark your lines, draw them out, and then stitch them out with ease as well. So it's a great confidence builder when you're first starting out quilting. Okay, there is our quilting all finished. I've taken this back to the heat press to remove all those quilting lines. Looks good on both sides and there are no puckers. And we've still got our pocket flopping about freely. Now it's time to bind this, but we've got to square it up first. I like to use reference lines when I'm squaring up my quilts or quilted projects. I'm going to use this seam line here as my reference line to start squaring up the placemat. So I'll place my cutting ruler over the edge of that line to the end of my fabric that measures 6 1/4 inches. I'm going to take it back to 6 inches. So from this line here, I'm going to measure out 6 inches to the outside edge. So I'll line up the 6-inch line here on that straight sewn line and I can cut that excess off. Now that this side is nice and straight, I can come around here and I'll use this line and this line as my reference line for cutting straight. So I'll place a straight line over the seam there and you want to hope that that's a nice straight line there, and then you can just trim off the fabric so that you're taking off the least amount of fabric along the top edge. At this stage it doesn't really matter what size your placemat's going to be unless you're making a bunch of them. Then you want to make sure they're all the same size. I don't have a reference line along the side here, so I'm just going to use this straight edge. The other alternative is that I can flip my ruler around and use this straight edge here and the straight edge along here. And from this reference line out, I'm going to cut 12 1/2 inches and I'll have a straight edge along here as well. So straight edge here, give me a perfectly square quilt or placemat. Then you'll continue on down using that straight edge along here and the straight edge along the side that you've just cut. And then we have our final edge to be straightened. So from there I can use the straight edge along the seam line here and along this side here. And again I'll cut off the least amount of fabric as possible. And there we have a nicely squared up placemat. So from the seam here, we've come out 6 inches. From the seam again here, we've come out 12.5 inches on that side. And if you want a finished measurement, we have got 12.5 inches high. So the finished measurement of our placemat is now 18.5 inches wide by 12.5 inches high. And now it's time to put our binding on. If you have your favourite type of binding that you like to use for quilt making, then you can go ahead and do that. If you want to do a 2.5 inch strip, fold it over and do a proper quilted binding, that's fine. I do have a video in the crochet needle pouch that will show you how to do that. The binding that we're going to be putting on here is a double fold binding strip, and I'm using a piece of fabric that was 1.5 inches to begin with, and once the folds have been pressed over, it'll end up about 3/4 of an inch or just under 2 centimetres. And something to note when you're creating bias binding or your strips, if you run them through your little bias binding machine or your tools, and even the ones that you purchase ready-made, the folds on either side, the ready-made ones, the folds are always a different size. Fold on the left-hand side here is about 8 millimetres or just over 1/4 of an inch, and the one on the other side is 9 millimetres or 3/8 of an inch. So you've got a narrow side and a wide side. I'm not familiar with all of the bias tips that you can purchase, so I don't know if they do the same thing. But if you make your own, it's certainly worth checking on your tips whether you have different widths on the inside. And if you do, that's really helpful. So whether you're using a store-bought bias binding or you make your own bindings, we're going to apply the same technique. And what we want here is the narrowest side to line up along the top edge of the fabric. And there's only 1 millimetre difference, and I don't even know what that is in inches, it's that little. We're going to line up the edge of our bias on the edge of the fabric. We're going to leave a tail of a couple of inches, 2 to 3 inches, and where this pin is where I'm actually going to start sewing. So I'll start here with the back stitch, continue on to the end. It's a good idea to double check the measurement of the first fold, and for me that's about 8.5 millimetres. I'm going to sew almost to the end and then stop 8.5 millimetres from the edge. So what that means is that if this fold was 1/4 of an inch, you would stop 1/4 of an inch from the end of your placemat. So we'll sew all the way down here. When you get to that point, you'll back stitch and take your work off the machine. From that point, you'll take your fabric here and you're going to flip it up, and you don't have to worry about opening this out. You just flip the fabric up and create a diagonal, so you've got a 45-degree angle here, and then all you'll do is flip it back down again, and you want to flip this piece of binding down toward you again, right on the very edge of that fabric that you've just sewn. So if I just put my ruler there as a guide to show you, and then from here you can go back in the ditch and sew all the way down to the other end, and you'll repeat that for all 4 corners. So what you have here is a triangular fold here that is straight along the top edge here, but it will also be straight along this edge here. And this is what's going to give you really nicely mitered corners when we turn the binding around later. So again, start sewing here. Once you've got it all lined up, then you start sewing from here down to the other end, and you'll continue that process until you've done all 4 corners. I'll show you this in more detail at the machine. Okay, I've removed my pin and the needle is ready to come down into that ditch or that folded edge of the fabric. Back stitch and continue to the end. backstitch. So I've come to the end and I've backstitched. At this point here, have the top of the placemat facing you, or the quilt, flip it up and away from you, and the corner of the fabric wants to line up with the corner of your placemat. So if you have a look at that there, that's lined up nicely just up on the corner there. Then you can take your fabric and flip it forward again, and then you can start sewing from that fold again. And you'll continue all the way down. Now we're coming up to the pocket here. When you get to that, keep everything lined up nicely, but I'm going to stitch over that a couple of times just to reinforce that. And I'll continue to the end. I've backstitched at the next corner, and again all I'll do is flip it up, fold it out to the corner there, and fold it forward. So again I've got a nice straight edge along here, and the folds here are even as well. And I'm coming up to the end here, so I've got a couple of inches, I've got 2 to 3 inches here that have been unstitched. I'm going to do the same thing at this end as well. I'll backstitch here, and we'll go back to the cutting table and I'll show you what to do from here. We've sewn our binding strip on all the way around, and we've got an opening of, there's about 3 inches left open along here. With this tail here, the one we started with, you can leave that folded on this side, take your fabric and fold that so that you've got a nice 45-degree line along here, and pin that in place for the time being. And this one here, we're going to do the same thing, but instead of folding it down, we're going to fold it away from us. So bring the fabric out across where that diagonal line there meets the fabric just here. Pin that, take your binding strip and flip that away. You want these two folds to just touch. So I've got this strip here folded down, this strip here folded up and away, and where the folds are, that's going to be our stitching line to join these two pieces. So you just finger press that really well. Remove the pins. When you completely open out the fabric here, we've got our raw edges folded right out on the top and the bottom one. This is the fold that we've created earlier, so I've just pinned along there. We're going to sew from this intersection here all the way along to the other intersection just there. Okay, so we just want to sew a diagonal line right across. This gets a little bit fiddly because you don't have much room to work with. If you want to, you can leave a much bigger opening along here. It's not going to be a problem at all as long as you get your measurements right. I will take this to the machine and quickly sew that diagonal. So I've sewn the two pieces together on the diagonal here, and I can already tell there's too much slack in the fabric, so I'm going to have to redo this. This needs to sit nice and flat when you sew it together. There's just a little bit too much play in here, so I'm going to go back and sew that properly. And I can see looking at that now, I didn't actually stitch on the fold. Okay, I've trimmed off that little bit of excess here, and you can see I've got a diagonal line going across here, joining these two pieces of fabric. Finger press that open, and if you find it's too loose underneath, you can actually go back and sew a little bit closer in to tighten up that piece of fabric. We can now trim off the excess and fold these edges back under so that they're nicely lined up with the beginning and the end. You might just have to repress that fold line just to make it look nice and straight underneath. And we can go back to the machine and sew this down to here, and that will close up the whole binding. I will quickly do that now. Okay, so this is where we started, came around, finished up here. I've just finished that section up, and now we're ready to turn our binding to the other side, and you can see that's nice and straight along there. You can press the binding away from the placemat. Now ideally, when you have your binding on like this, you want to be able to fold that over to the other side and have this folded edge of your binding overlapping that line of stitching that we've done when we put the binding in place. So you want this fold here to fold over and beyond that line of stitching. Now you can see that on this side it does, but that's because I've cheated. It didn't quite line up for me, and that's because when I sewed the binding down, I should have actually stitched a couple of threads away from the folded edge, so closer to the raw edge. Then that would have allowed for the fabric to fold over nicely like that. I had forgotten to make an allowance for the thickness of the placemat. So that's why when I fold it over, it falls a little bit short. So I've trimmed this side down. This is just under 1/4 inch from the stitching line. And on this side here, it's just under 3/8 inch. So I'm going to go and trim the other 3 sides down quickly without cutting the binding. Then that'll be narrow enough that I can flip my binding over and I can actually come around and stitch in the ditch at the top. Okay, now that I've fixed my little mistake there, we're ready to fold the binding to the other side. Just fold that straight across. That will now sit below that stitching line, and from the top we can sew it together. When you get to the corner here, fold your fabric over and keep folding that all the way to the end. Finger press that, and you've got a nice mitre along here, and then fold that fabric under, and you'll continue that mitre to the other side. So you can see by folding this edge over here, push it out and give yourself a nice crease. Then you can bring that back over again. On this side, you've got a nice mitered edge, and it follows through to the other side as well. And then you just keep folding everything over. And I prefer to just do the corners. The rest of it I can fold under as I sew. Okay, this is all ready to go and stitch in place. So we're going to sew from the top. We'll sew right in the ditch on the very edge of the fabric, and that will pick up the binding on the other side. There is an alternative method to this if you don't want to do binding at all. Stay tuned. Okay, it does not matter where you start at all, and this seems like as good a place as any. So we will just stitch right in the ditch along the edge of the binding. And then you'll stitch right into the corner, but not through the binding. Leave your needle down, turn your work around and continue to sew. This is something that you need to go slow with, because otherwise you'll run off track and end up stitching on your binding. Okay, we've completely finished this except for one step that's optional. So the binding is stitched in place. I've stitched in the ditch all the way around the edge, and on the other side I have missed a couple of little spots there, but I can live with that. On the other side it's sewn all the way down around the sides, and your corners are nicely mitered. Now this is all ready for you to use, but I decided that rather than letting the cutlery flop around like this, I'm going to sew a couple of channels in here. So from there and here, I'm going to sew a couple of straight lines straight down there. All we're going to do is divide this in thirds, make those 3 equal compartments, and then we'll get the cutlery in there. That'll sit nicely. They're not going to clang about. I've marked a pin in just shy of 2 inches from the edges here, and that should be evenly spaced. I'll backstitch at the top here, sew down both sections there. All right, and there we have our completely finished placemat with a cutlery holder. This would be perfect for kids to roll up and take to camp with them, and you could even roll this up, put a little tie around it if you like, but you can roll this up and place it in a picnic set, and then you've got your table set perfectly every time. It'll make a great personalised gift as well. You can put a child's name on here, all sorts of things. Now, I promised you another way to do this. Instead of doing the binding, what you can do is quilt the batting and the top layer of fabric without your backing fabric on there. So you can just do the 2 layers, put everything together as normal, and then instead of taking your backing fabric and putting it behind your fabric and squaring everything up, place your backing fabric on top with right side facing. So what I mean by that, take your backing fabric, place it over the top of your quilted placemat with a pocket in place, right sides together. Make sure all of the fabric is the same size. Then you can sew all the way around the entire placemat and leave an opening for turning through. Then you can turn the whole thing the right way around, and basically all you're doing is bagging it out. So you won't have a binding on the edge of your placemat at all. So you've got 2 options. You can either bind it or do a much quicker version. But I do kind of like the framed placemat. I think that makes it look a little bit more elegant. So what do you think of that? I think the fabric is absolutely adorable, isn't it? It's a perfect fabric for an afternoon tea party, isn't it? I hope you've enjoyed this video. It was a nice, simple one to make. Obviously, it'll be a lot easier if you don't put binding on it and you bag it out instead, but I think it actually looks nicer with the binding framing it. What do you think? I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I shall catch you next time. Bye for now.